There is a saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It captures a recurring human truth. Actions born from conviction and moral certainty can, when left unchecked, lead not to salvation but to harm. The desire to do good can become a justification for control. Certainty can harden into righteousness. Devotion can quiet doubt. What begins as faith can, over time, become obedience to power rather than conscience. This story unfolds along that road. This is the cautionary story of the Sodalitium Christianae Vitae, a group within the Catholic Church that began with declared ideals of spiritual renewal and discipline, yet gradually lost its way. Its internal logic drifted so far from its original purpose that in the end, the Church itself was forced to intervene and dismantle the organization to prevent further harm and a deeper scandal. Part 1. Not all destructive groups begin with malice. Many begin with certainty, conviction, and a promise to restore what feels lost. They form around discipline, belonging, and ideals that appear noble. Order in chaos, meaning in confusion. Faith in an uncertain world. Only later, often much later, does control replace purpose, loyalty replace conscience, and silence replace truth. Sodalitium followed that path. In the early 1970s, Peru was marked by instability. Military rule, political polarization, and social upheaval left many young people distrustful of both revolutionary movements and institutional politics. Amid this uncertainty, some sought certainty in religion, not comfort, but structure, clarity, and discipline. From the outset, Sodalitium's recruitment strategy was highly selective. It focused on elite private schools, particularly institutions run by the Marist brothers, and often targeted only children. This selectivity was deliberate. Only children were viewed as ideal recruits, unencumbered by siblings and in many cases future heirs to family estates. Their complete commitment also meant that parental wealth could, over time, be redirected toward the organization. In 1971, in Lima, Luis Fernando Figari, a charismatic layman, began gathering young men around a vision of disciplined Christian life. He was not ordained, but he spoke with authority and conviction. He believed modern society was morally weakened and that faith had been diluted by tolerance and doubt. What was needed, he argued, was rigor. The group he founded took the name Sodalitium, presenting itself as a brotherhood bound to Christian life. It was framed as a lay movement dedicated to spiritual formation, obedience, and moral clarity. Some of Sodalitium's earliest communal houses were established in San Bartolo, a beachfront suburb roughly 50 kilometers south of Lima, known for its surfing beaches and holiday homes. The location offered isolation, prestige, and proximity to affluent families with second residences along the coast. At times, members approached holiday homeowners whose children had attended the same elite schools from which Sodalitium recruited. They asked directly whether the family would consider donating their beach house to the church. Such requests were not always met with reverence. More than once, they were answered with disbelief, laughter, and a blunt instruction to leave immediately. In its early years, there was little outwardly scandalous. Parents saw commitment, church leaders saw discipline, young men found belonging, identity, and purpose. What was not seen, what could not yet be seen, was how easily discipline could turn into domination. Part 2. From its earliest period, Sodalitium emphasized absolute obedience. Members were taught that surrendering personal will was a spiritual virtue. Leaders were presented as instruments of divine guidance, and questioning authority was equated with spiritual pride. Suffering was not merely accepted, it was sanctified. Emotional suppression, humiliation, and endurance were framed as tools of purification. Pain signified growth. Resistance signified failure. The ideal member was silent, controlled, loyal, and detached from outside influence. Family ties were discouraged. Friendships beyond the group were viewed with suspicion. Individual identity was gradually replaced by institutional identity. These practices were described internally as formation. In practice, they created dependency. The culture that emerged displayed the familiar traits of cult-like behavior, authoritarian leadership, suppression of dissent, isolation from external relationships, moral absolutism, and the redefinition of harm as virtue. None of this required explicit malice. It required certainty, reinforced by unchecked power. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Sodalitium expanded. New houses were opened. Younger recruits, including teenagers, were accepted. The movement extended beyond Peru into other countries. At the same time, it cultivated influence within conservative circles of the Church. Its discipline contrasted sharply with what some leaders perceived as doctrinal looseness elsewhere. The organization presented itself as orthodox, loyal, and uncompromising. In 1997, the Vatican formally recognized Sodalitium as a society of apostolic life. For supporters, this recognition was validation. For those within the organization, it reinforced a dangerous belief that the system itself had been approved by God. With recognition came confidence. With confidence came entrenchment. Behind the disciplined exterior, complaints accumulated. Former members later described sexual abuse, physical punishment, and psychological coercion, particularly involving young recruits under the authority of superiors. Allegations included assault, exploitation, and violations carried out through spiritual manipulation. What made these accusations especially grave was not only the acts themselves, but the context in which they occurred. Abuse perpetrated by figures presented as moral and spiritual authorities within a system that discouraged disclosure and punished dissent. Victims were often told they had misunderstood events, lacked spiritual maturity, or were endangering their souls by speaking out. Some were blamed outright. Internally, allegations were minimized or dismissed. Externally, critics were portrayed as hostile to the Church. For years, silence prevailed. As scrutiny increased, attention turned to Sodalitium's financial practices. Questions arose regarding land holdings, donations, and the accumulation of assets during the organization's expansion. Survivors and journalists alleged mismanagement, lack of transparency, and the use of institutional wealth to shield leadership, rather than address harm. Properties acquired during periods of coercive practices became points of contention. Critics argued that resources obtained through an abusive system demanded accountability and restitution. The financial dimension added another layer to the crisis. Power was not only spiritual, but material. Part 3. The turning point came in the early 2010s, when former members began speaking publicly in greater numbers. Their independently gathered testimonies revealed strikingly similar experiences across time and geography. In 2015, Peruvian journalists published a major investigation based on survivor accounts. What had long been denied could no longer be dismissed. Patterns were documented, names were named, practices were exposed. Civil authorities took notice. So did Rome. The Vatican initiated formal investigations into Sodalitium's practices, leadership, and internal culture. Testimonies were collected. Structures were examined. What had been defended as formation was reclassified as abuse of power and abuse of conscience. At the center of the findings stood Luis Fernando Figari. The Vatican determined that Figari bore responsibility for grave misconduct, including sexual abuse and systemic harm. He was permanently removed from authority, forbidden from contact with the movement, and ordered into isolation. The intervention did not end with one individual. Recognizing that the problems were structural rather than incidental, Rome imposed external oversight, stripped Sodalitium of its autonomy, dismantled leadership structures, halted recruitment, and banned its formation practices. In time, the conclusion became unavoidable. After years of investigation, supervision, and failed attempts at reform, the Vatican issued a papal order dissolving Sodalitium. The decision acknowledged that the organization's culture, governance, and history of abuse made its continued existence unjustifiable. This was not a rejection of faith, but a recognition that the institution itself had become irreparably compromised. Dissolution was carried out deliberately, governance was terminated, assets were placed under external control, members were reassigned individually or released, affiliated branches were wound down, there was no dramatic announcement. The movement was dismantled piece by piece. Alongside ecclesiastical action, civil legal cases continued. In Peru and other jurisdictions, survivors pursued claims involving sexual abuse, physical violence, psychological harm, and institutional cover-ups. Some cases were reopened after years of delay. Others examined whether leadership had obstructed justice or intimidated victims into silence. Financial accountability remains unresolved, particularly regarding compensation, reparations, and the disposition of organizational assets. Many cases are still ongoing. Today, Sodalitium exists only as aftermath. There is no recruitment, no formation, no authority. The founder remains isolated, former members are scattered, some still within church structures, many outside them entirely. Survivors continue to seek justice, recognition, and repair. Some have found their voices, others remain silent, carrying the long-term effects of spiritual and psychological harm. The Church treats the case as a warning, not a success story. Sodalitium's story matters not because it is unique, but because it is familiar. Groups often form with good intentions. They promise certainty, belonging, and purpose. But when authority becomes absolute, dissent is moralized, and suffering is reframed as virtue, control replaces faith. Unchecked obedience corrodes conscience. Silence protects power, and harm becomes invisible until it no longer can be. Sodalitium did not collapse overnight. It unraveled slowly, exposed by testimony, investigation, and time. Its end was not redemption, it was reckoning. And its legacy stands as a reminder written in human cost, that faith without accountability becomes power, that power without limits becomes abuse, and that even institutions built on conviction must, eventually, answer to truth.